Master Chief Elias Thorne, U.S. Navy SEAL, retired, had run out of road. The finality of it was as quiet and cold as the Oregon rain soaking through the canvas top of his dead Ford Bronco. With him was Dutch, a Belgian Malinois with a map of scars on his muzzle and the same ghosts in his eyes. They were down to the last of the disability checks, a few $100s that wouldn't cover a week in a motel, let alone a new alternator. Thorne had heard about a storage unit auction in a forgotten industrial park on the edge of town, a place where things went to be forgotten. For $50, he won Unit C-13, the one nobody else wanted, expecting only a dry place to wait out the storm of his life. But on the second night, Dutch, the dog who had once dragged him from the rubble of a collapsed building in Kandahar, froze. He stared at the back concrete wall, a low growl vibrating in his chest, and would not let it go. Behind that wall waited a secret sealed for 20 years, a secret that would drag Thorne back into a war he thought he'd left behind and give him a reason to live again. The war he carried wasn't one of flags and headlines. It was a war of memory, fought every night in the close confines of the Bronco's back seat. It was the smell of diesel and scorched earth, the fine gray dust that coated everything after the IED turned a mud brick compound into a tomb. He'd been inside, clearing the second floor, when the world dissolved into pressure and noise. He remembered the sickening fall, the weight of the ceiling beams pinning his leg, and the darkness that followed. He woke to a frantic, wet scratching and a hot breath on his face. It was Dutch, his military working dog, clawing through debris, whining and nudging until Thorne found the strength to pull himself free. The dog had saved his life, and in the years that followed, he'd saved his soul. The leg healed with a permanent limp and a network of jagged scars. The mind, however, was a different kind of wound. The VA diagnosed him with severe PTSD, gave him pills that dulled the world, and sent him on his way. His wife, Maria, tried to hold on, but he was a ghost in his own home, scanning exits, sleeping in 2-hour shifts, unable to tolerate the noise of their children. She left, not with anger, but with a quiet, exhausted grief. "Come back to us when you find your way home, Elias," she'd said. He hadn't found it. Instead, he'd drifted, taking odd jobs on fishing boats in Alaska and as a security guard in Wyoming, always moving before the flashbacks got too bad or the questions got too personal. Now, the road had ended here, in a town called Havenwood, Oregon, a place that had seen better days, much like himself. The timber mill had closed a decade ago, leaving behind a hollowed-out economy and a persistent damp chill that seemed to seep into the bones. He and Dutch had been living in the Bronco for 6 months, and the old truck had finally given up, its engine a block of silent, rusted metal. The storage unit wasn't a choice. It was the last square on the board. The auction was a sad affair held under a dripping gray sky. A handful of locals, vultures in flannel and worn denim, picked over the contents of repossessed lives. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson with a stained windbreaker and a weary voice, moved through the units with little ceremony. Unit C-13 was last. When Henderson cut the rusted lock and rolled up the corrugated steel door, a smell of damp earth and decay rolled out. The locals wrinkled their noses and stepped back. Inside was a mess of rotted cardboard boxes, a stack of bald tires, and a threadbare army cot. "All right, what am I bid for this treasure trove?" Henderson asked, his tone thick with sarcasm. The crowd was silent. $10? Anyone give me 10? Thorne stood in the back, Dutch sitting silently at his heel, his presence a calm anchor in the man's quiet storm. He needed a roof. Any roof. 50, Thorne said, his voice raspy from disuse. Heads turned. A few people snickered. Henderson's eyes, sharp and assessing, found him. He took in Thorne's military-style haircut, the straightness of his back despite the limp, and the disciplined stillness of the dog beside him. He saw a man who wasn't buying junk. He was buying shelter. "Sold for $50 to the gentleman in the back," Henderson said, banging a small rubber mallet against the doorframe. After the others had drifted away, Henderson handed him the key and a fresh lock. The fellow who had this unit name was Frank Miller. Kept to himself, paid in cash for 20 years, right on time. Then the payments just stopped. Post office returned his mail. He paused, looking out over the damp asphalt. "You military?" Thorne just nodded. Henderson grunted, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Miller was too. "Army, I think. Just be careful." A few months after he passed, some men in a fancy car came asking about this unit. Seemed real interested in what might be inside. I told them it was state property until auction, and they didn't like that one bit. He handed Thorne the paperwork. "Place is yours. Good luck to you." Thorne just nodded again, the $50 feeling like the biggest gamble of his life. He led Dutch to the unit, the steel door rumbling down behind them, shutting out the gray world and sealing them inside the cold, musty dark. The first night was a kind of grim peace. Thorne laid out his sleeping bag on the dusty concrete floor, the cot's canvas having long since surrendered to mildew. Dutch curled up beside him, a warm, living weight that kept the worst of the memories at bay. For the first time in months, they were out of the rain, shielded from the wind that rattled the thin metal walls. Thorne slept, not well, but better than he had in the Bronco. The second day, he set about making the space habitable, clearing the sodden cardboard and stacking the old tires neatly against the back wall. It was mindless work, the kind of physical task that quieted the noise in his head. But as he worked, he noticed Dutch wasn't settling. The dog, usually calm and observant when Thorne was near, was agitated. He paced back and forth in front of the stacked tires, his nose twitching, a low whine catching in his throat. "Easy, boy," Thorne murmured, assuming a rat or a raccoon had found its way into the wall. Nothing there. But Dutch wouldn't stop. He began pawing at the concrete floor just in front of the wall, his claws making a dry, scraping sound. He'd dig for a moment, then stop, cock his head, and let out a single, sharp bark, his eyes fixed on one specific spot. Thorne tried to distract him with a piece of jerky, then with a firm command. "Dutch, leave it." The dog would obey for a moment, his training deeply ingrained, but then his attention would inevitably drift back to the wall, his focus absolute. This was not idle behavior. This was the same focused intensity Dutch displayed when he was searching for explosives, a state of concentration that meant he had detected something unseen, something wrong. By the third day, Thorne could no longer ignore it. The dog's certainty was a force of nature. He knelt beside Dutch, running a hand over the dog's tense shoulders. "All right, what is it? What have you got?" He pushed the heavy tires aside, revealing the bare concrete wall behind them. It looked solid, uniform, stained with years of damp. But Dutch was now nudging a specific spot near the floor with his nose, whining with more urgency. Thorne pressed his hand against the cold concrete. Nothing. He knocked on it with his knuckles. The sound was a dull thud, 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 and then, in the exact spot Dutch indicated, thump, a hollow sound. His eyes narrowed. He ran his fingers over the surface, feeling for any imperfection. There, almost invisible to the eye, was a hairline seam, a perfect rectangle about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, filled in with concrete dust and grime. It wasn't a crack. It was a cut. Someone had put a door in this wall and sealed it up to look like it was never there. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. Henderson's warning about the men in the fancy car echoed in his mind. This wasn't just a storage unit. It was a tomb, or a safe, and Dutch had just found the key. Thorne retrieved the heavy-duty tire iron from his rucksack. It was pitted with rust, but still a solid piece of steel. He wedged the flattened end into the hairline seam and leaned into it with all his weight. For a moment, nothing happened. The concrete held fast. He adjusted his grip, found better leverage, and pushed again, his muscles straining against the unyielding wall. A faint cracking sound, then a puff of gray dust. A small section of the seam gave way. He worked the iron back and forth, slowly, methodically, widening the crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the grime. Dutch stood back, watching, a low, encouraging growl rumbling in his chest. After 10 minutes of grueling work, a whole section of the false panel broke loose. It wasn't concrete through and through. It was a thin, concrete fascia over a steel plate. Beneath it, he found a set of welded hinges and a recessed handle. This was no amateur job. This was built to last, and built to hide. He pried the rest of the panel away, revealing the dull gray of the steel door. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening into a dark, cramped space. The air that flowed out was stale but dry, smelling of oil and old paper. Using the flashlight from his pack, Thorne peered inside. It was a small, concrete-lined cavity, no bigger than a closet. And inside, sitting squarely in the middle of the floor, was a single olive-drab military footlocker. It was heavy, solid steel, with the name Sergeant Frank Miller stenciled in white on the lid. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal and a wrapped oilcloth bundle. Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs. He dragged the footlocker out into the main part of the unit. The latches were stiff, but not locked. He lifted the lid. His breath caught in his throat. It was filled to the brim with cash. Bundles of $100 bills, $50 bills, 20s, all bound with simple rubber bands. The bills were old, non-sequential, the kind that couldn't be traced. He didn't count it, but he knew from his time in operations where large cash transactions were common that he was looking at a fortune. Millions, maybe tens of millions. He slowly closed the lid, his mind reeling. He picked up the oilcloth bundle next. Unwrapping it, he found a well-cared-for Colt 1911 pistol and 2 full magazines. It felt familiar and heavy in his hand. Finally, he opened the journal. The first page read, Frank Miller, Sergeant, U.S. Army Rangers. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. And it probably means they're coming for you next. Thorne sat down on the cold floor, Dutch resting his head on his knee, and began to read. Miller's story unfolded in neat, disciplined cursive. After leaving the service, he'd taken a job as a foreman for a local construction company owned by a man named Marcus Galloway. Galloway was a pillar of the community, a philanthropist building parks and community centers. But Miller, with a soldier's eye for logistics and a distaste for corruption, saw the truth. Galloway was using the construction projects to launder money for a cartel, inflating costs, using shell corporations, and hiding millions in cash. Miller started documenting everything, collecting evidence. He decided he couldn't just turn it over. Galloway owned the local sheriff and a county judge, so he did what a ranger does when faced with an entrenched enemy. He sabotaged the operation from within. He began siphoning off the laundered cash, hiding it, planning to use it to burn Galloway's empire to the ground. The footlocker was his war chest. The journal was the proof. The last entry was dated almost a year ago. Galloway knows someone is bleeding him. His men are watching me. I've sealed this place up. It's the only leverage I have. If I disappear, this is the reason why. Don't let him get it. Use it to finish the job for all the people he's buried to build his kingdom. Thorne closed the journal. He looked at the money, the gun, and the dog sitting faithfully by his side. He had come here to disappear, to find a quiet end. Instead, he had inherited a war. The next morning, the world came looking for him. A low, expensive rumble disturbed the quiet of the industrial park. Thorne was sitting on the cot, cleaning the 1911, the methodical motions a calming ritual from a past life. Dutch, lying near the partially open door, lifted his head and let out a growl that was more a vibration than a sound. Thorne set the gun down, covered it with a rag, and moved to the door, peering through the gap. A black Lincoln Navigator, polished to a mirror shine despite the mud-splattered road, was idling 50 yards away. The driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place among the rusting storage units. He had silver hair, a confident smile, and the predatory stillness of a hawk. He walked directly toward Unit C-13. Thorne stepped outside, positioning himself with the door at his back, Dutch at his side, a silent, furry warning. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth and practiced. "You must be the new tenant. My name is Marcus Galloway." The name hit Thorne like a physical blow, but he kept his face a mask of detached neutrality. "I own Galloway Development. We're in the process of acquiring this entire property. Going to tear it down and build a vocational training center for the community." He gestured expansively, as if envisioning a gleaming future on the cracked asphalt. "I was sorry to hear about the passing of the previous tenant, Frank Miller. He was a good man, worked for me for a time. I was hoping to secure his old unit to preserve any personal effects for his next of kin, but the auction happened so quickly." Galloway's eyes, a pale, cold blue, scanned Thorne, taking in his worn clothes, the limp, the quiet intensity. He was assessing, calculating. "Look, I know this is an unusual request, but I'd be willing to buy the unit and its contents from you. Let's say $5,000? Cash. A little something to help you get back on your feet." The offer was too quick, too generous. It was a lure. Dutch's growl deepened, the hair on his back standing rigid. He hadn't moved, but his entire body was a coiled spring of distrust. "Not for sale?" Thorne said, his voice level. Galloway's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "I think you might be underestimating my generosity. 10,000. That's my final offer. It's more than this junk is worth. It's more than you'll see in a year." "I said it's not for sale," Thorne repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The finality in his tone was absolute. For a long moment the two men stood in silence, the only sound the distant highway and the low hum of the Navigator's engine. Galloway's facade finally cracked. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He turned and walked back to his vehicle, climbing inside without a backward glance. As the SUV pulled away, Thorne saw the face of another man in the passenger seat, a burly figure with a flattened nose watching him intently. The meeting had been a probe, an attempt to gauge the man who had stumbled upon the secret. They had expected a desperate vagrant they could easily buy off or intimidate. They had found something else. An hour later, Thorne did a quiet sweep of the perimeter. Near the chain-link fence that bordered the woods, half hidden in the damp grass, he found it. A freshly discarded cigarette butt, the filter still warm. Marlboro, the same brand Galloway had been holding in his hand. They weren't just watching, they were closing in. Elias knew he couldn't stay put. The storage unit was a trap, a fixed position they could besiege at their leisure. He needed information, and he needed mobility. Taking a few $1,000s from one of the bundles, he stuffed it into his rucksack along with the journal and the pistol. He left the footlocker hidden behind the false wall, resealing it as best he could to look undisturbed. He and Dutch slipped out of the facility on foot, melting into the woods that bordered the property. 2 miles later, they emerged onto a county road, where he paid cash for a ride into town from a passing farmer. His first stop was a pawn shop, where he bought a cheap, untraceable burner phone. His second was a small, out-of-the-way motel called the Pine Cone, paying for a week in cash under a false name. Once in the room, he used the motel's spotty Wi-Fi to begin his reconnaissance. Marcus Galloway was exactly who he claimed to be, and more. He was Havenwood's favorite son. His name was on the library, the high school football stadium, the children's wing of the local hospital. News articles praised his generosity, his vision, his commitment to revitalizing the dying town. But Thorne dug deeper, past the puff pieces and into public records. He searched for property deeds, zoning variances, and eminent domain filings. A pattern began to emerge. Over the past 15 years, Galloway Development had acquired huge swaths of land for projects that often stalled or changed. In nearly a dozen cases, the original landowners were elderly or in financial trouble, and they sold for pennies on the dollar. 3 of them had simply vanished, their properties falling into foreclosure and bought at auction by one of Galloway's shell corporations. It was a slow, methodical conquest, hidden behind a mask of civic duty. The next day, he went to the Clackamas County Records Office. He needed to see the original paperwork, the hard copies that couldn't be altered online. The clerk at the counter was a woman in her late 40s named Sarah Jenkins. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. When Thorne asked for the files on Frank Miller's last known address and any properties associated with Galloway's earliest projects, she gave him a long, searching look. "That's a strange combination of requests," she said, her voice low. "Are you a reporter?" "Just a man with an interest in local history," Thorne replied evasively. He mentioned Frank Miller's name again. Sarah's face softened for a fraction of a second. "My Uncle David served with a Frank Miller, 75th Ranger Regiment. He always said Frank was the most squared-away man he ever knew. He never believed the official story." "Official story?" Thorne asked. "They said he died in a hiking accident, slipped and fell into the Clackamas River. Never found the body. She disappeared into the archives and returned with a stack of dusty files. As Thorne paged through them, she stood nearby, ostensibly sorting mail. He found what he was looking for: forged signatures, backdated permits, deeds transferred with impossible speed. And on each questionable document, the same authorizing signature from a county supervisor who had, according to a quick search on Thorne's phone, retired to a waterfront home in Florida 3 years ago. Sarah leaned over his shoulder. Funny how many documents for Galloway's projects were processed right before a holiday weekend, isn't it? She whispered. Almost like someone wanted to avoid scrutiny. She knew. She didn't know everything, but she knew something was rotten. Before he left, she slipped him a piece of paper. It was her personal cell number. My uncle always said Frank was working on something big, something that was going to blow this town wide open, she said. If you find anything at all, you call me. Some of us still believe in the truth around here. That night, the net tightened. As Thorne lay on the lumpy motel bed, reading Miller's journal again, Dutch suddenly shot to his feet. A silent, menacing growl aimed at the door. Thorne was on his feet in an instant, the 1911 in his hand, his body moving with an old, familiar economy. He heard a faint scraping sound at the lock. Someone was trying to jimmy the door. He moved to the side, flattening himself against the wall, his finger resting on the trigger guard. Dutch remained silent, a statue of deadly intent. The scraping stopped. A moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps retreating quickly. They had been testing him, seeing if the room was occupied. They knew where he was. The time for quiet investigation was over. Galloway couldn't afford a loose end like Thorne. A homeless vet with nothing to lose was unpredictable, and the journal was a stick of dynamite waiting for a match. He couldn't risk Thorne going to the state police or the FBI. He needed the journal, the money, and the man all gone, turned to ash and smoke. He dispatched his two heavy hitters, the man with the flattened nose from the SUV and another one just as large, with a simple order. Burn the storage facility to the ground. Make it look like a tragic accident, faulty wiring, a vagrant's campfire gone wrong. Eliminate anyone who gets in the way. But Thorne was a step ahead. He knew the motel was compromised, and he knew Galloway's primary target would be the storage unit, where he believed the evidence was still hidden. After the attempted break-in, Thorne had paid the motel clerk for another night to create the illusion he was still there. Then he and Dutch had slipped out the back and made their way back across town under the cover of darkness. He was waiting. He sat in the blackness of Unit C-13, the steel footlocker now empty, its contents secured in his rucksack. He wasn't there to protect the money. He was there to protect Frank Miller's legacy, the truth the man had died for. He felt a strange kinship with the dead ranger, a shared duty that transcended time. Shortly after 2 a.m., he heard the quiet crunch of tires on gravel. A dark panel van without license plates rolled to a stop a few units down. Two men got out, carrying gas cans and bolt cutters. Thorne didn't feel panic. He felt the old, cold math of the problem, the familiar calculus of angles, timing, and violence. He left Dutch inside the unit with a quiet command to stay and slipped out the back, using a pre-cut section of the fence to move silently through the shadows. The men worked quickly, snapping the locks on several units, including Thorne's. They began splashing gasoline, the acrid smell filling the night air. "Make sure you get C-13 good," one of them grunted. "Boss wants that one gone yesterday." Thorne moved like a ghost. He came up behind the first man as he was fumbling with a lighter. A single, precise strike to the base of the skull with the butt of the 1911, and the man collapsed without a sound. The second man, the one from the SUV, heard the muffled thud and turned, his eyes wide. He was faster, reaching for a knife sheathed on his belt. But Thorne was already moving, closing the distance. The fight was short and brutal. It wasn't a brawl. It was a clinical disassembly. Thorne deflected the knife, broke the man's wrist with a sharp twist, and followed with a series of debilitating strikes to the throat and knee. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Just as Thorne thought it was over, a third man emerged from the van, one he hadn't seen. This one was wiry and quick, and he came at Thorne from his blind side. He tackled Thorne, sending them both sprawling. The 1911 skittered across the asphalt. As they wrestled, the man pulled his own knife, a short, wicked-looking blade. He raised it for a killing blow. Suddenly, a black and brown blur erupted from the open door of C-13. Dutch, ignoring Thorne's command to stay, launched himself at the third attacker. He hit the man's chest with the force of a battering ram, his jaws clamping down on the arm holding the knife. The man screamed, a sound of pure agony and terror. He flailed wildly, and in his panic, he drove the knife downwards, burying it deep in Dutch's flank. The dog yelped, a high, pained sound that cut through Thorne more sharply than any bullet ever could. But he did not let go. He held on, his loyalty absolute even as blood poured from his side. Seeing Dutch wounded flipped a switch deep inside Elias Thorne. The cold, controlled soldier vanished, replaced by a primal rage. He surged to his feet, grabbed the fallen man by the throat, and slammed his head against the asphalt until he went limp. He disarmed him, secured the other two, then rushed to his dog. Dutch had collapsed, his breathing shallow, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Thorne ripped a strip from his own shirt, pressing it hard against the wound. "Hang on, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with a pain that had nothing to do with his own bruises. "Just hang on." He picked up one of the thug's phones. His first call was to 911, reporting an arson in progress and men down. His second call was to Sarah Jenkins. "It's happening," he said, his voice flat and cold as the steel in his hand. "Galloway tried to burn it all down. I have his men, and they hurt my dog. It's time to end this." The wail of sirens cut through the night. A local sheriff's department cruiser arrived first, its flashing lights painting the scene in stark strokes of red and blue. But minutes later, two state trooper vehicles, requested by Sarah Jenkins, who had immediately called a trusted contact in the state capitol, pulled in behind them, effectively taking control of the scene. The local deputies, one of whom Thorne recognized as a man who often dined with Galloway at the town's steakhouse, looked flustered and angry at the state's intervention. It was too late for a cover-up. The evidence was undeniable. 3 unconscious men, gas cans, bolt cutters, and a highly trained, grievously wounded military dog. Thorne, his face a grim mask, gave a concise, factual statement to a senior state trooper, omitting nothing. He handed over Frank Miller's journal. "Everything you need to know is in there," he said. "The motive for this is in a footlocker in Unit C-13. As paramedics tended to the thugs, Thorne refused medical attention for himself, focusing solely on Dutch. A trooper, a young man with a son in the Marines, helped him carefully lift the dog into the back of his cruiser and personally escorted them to the only all-night veterinary hospital 50 miles away. The next 48 hours were a blur for Thorne. He sat in the sterile waiting room of the vet clinic, Miller's journal having been photographed and entered into evidence, refusing to leave until he knew if Dutch would survive. Meanwhile, the case he had broken open was exploding. Faced with federal arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder charges, Galloway's men started talking. They sang, implicating their boss in everything from money laundering and extortion to the disappearance of Frank Miller. The state police, armed with the journal and the thug's confessions, raided Galloway's mansion and corporate offices. They found offshore bank records, coded ledgers, and enough evidence to unravel his entire criminal enterprise. Marcus Galloway, the beloved philanthropist of Havenwood, was arrested in his silk pajamas. The story became a statewide sensation. The quiet veteran who had been living in a storage unit was now the man who had toppled a kingpin. The names of the people Galloway had displaced and defrauded were finally printed in the paper, their stories told. Frank Miller was no longer a tragic accident. He was a hero who had died trying to expose the truth. Dutch pulled through. The vet, a former Army medic herself, worked tirelessly, and by the third day, the dog was awake, weak but alive. Thorne finally allowed himself to sleep. A month later, Thorne stood on a small, quiet piece of land he'd bought on a ridge overlooking the Clackamas River. It was paid for with a small portion of the money from the footlocker, which had been seized as evidence but was eventually released to him as the inheritor of Miller's effects. He had turned the vast majority of the fortune, over $37 million, over to a trust he'd established in Frank Miller's name. Managed by a board that included Sarah Jenkins, the trust was dedicated to providing legal aid and housing for veterans and others displaced by corporate predators like Galloway. Dutch lay in a patch of sunlight at Thorne's feet, a long, shaved patch on his side where the stitches were still healing, but his tail gave a weak thump against the ground. Thorne was no longer running. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter now, kept at bay by a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just a broken soldier waiting to die. He was a guardian, a keeper of a promise made to a dead man he'd never met. In his hand was a letter. The postmark was from his daughter's city. She had seen a news story about the Frank Miller Foundation and the anonymous veteran who had funded it. "Dad," it began, "I think you finally found your way home. We miss you." He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. The $50 storage unit he had bought as a place to disappear had become the one place on Earth where he had been found. It was the place that had saved him, not with the money it held, but with the mission it had given him. He looked down at his dog, the loyal friend who had started it all. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured, scratching behind Dutch's ears. "Time to go home."